simultaneous interpretation is available. You can activate it by pressing on the interpretation button in the bottom at the bottom of the screen. With that, I'm just gonna, and also I would like to remind everyone to keep their microphones muted, please. We're gonna have a Q&A at the end of the session. So if any of you would like to ask any question, please write it in the chat box. With that, I think I could start. So yeah, our topic for today is a really interesting one. It's about fossil fuel subsidies. And to be honest, I find it a bit hard to digest that in year 2023, we're still talking about this. But for anyone who has worked in public policy, you would know that public policies are hard to change. They're a bit stubborn, at least some of them. So it's not very surprising. But I'm not going to take much time in introducing the topic. I'm just going to go straight ahead to introduce our speakers, just to be a bit more efficient. So with us, we're going to have our main speaker, Neil McCulloch. And we're going to have as discussant with us Carol Nakhli, Dr. Carol Nakhli, and Mark Ayoub. So I'm going to introduce each of them, and then we're going to start with a presentation by Dr. Neil, and then we'll hear some comments from the discussants, and then open the floor to your questions. So allow me to start. Neil McCulloch, Dr. Neil is an economist and a director of the policy practice. His main area of focus is on the political economy of reform in the energy sector. This has included work on corruption in the electricity sector in Lebanon, power sector reform in Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, and Nigeria, energy access in India, aid to power sector reform in several countries in Africa, and fuel subsidy reform in Indonesia, Nigeria, and Zambia. Previously, Dr. McCulloch was the director of the economic policy program at Oxford Policy Management, and before that, he led the economist of the Australian aid program in Indonesia. So I welcome you, Dr. Neil. And then we have Dr. Carol Nakhli, who's the founder and chief executive officer of Crystal Energy, an advisory, research, and training firm in the UK. Her work focuses on the economics, energy, governance, and geopolitics nexus. She sits on the governing board of the Natural Resource Governance Institute and is a member of the advisory boards of the Middle East Institute and Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines. She is a lead energy expert with the Geopolitical Intelligence Services in Liechtenstein and associate fellow at the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs in Beirut, as well as at the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. She has published extensively and is an avid commentator on energy in the international media and at major conferences and industry gatherings. So welcome, Carol. Finally, Mark Ayoub is an energy policy researcher currently pursuing his PhD studies at the University of Galway in Ireland. He is an associate fellow at the AUB Issam Fares Institute of Public Policy and International Affairs, where he previously coordinated the Energy Policy and Security Program. His work aims to influence policymaking through evidence-based research, and he advocates national energy policies that utilize renewables as a centerpiece of the energy mix. He also wrote and he also worked on conducting energy audits and proposing energy efficiency measures on water and wastewater utilities across the country, as in Lebanon, and participated in producing papers on how to restructure and unbundle Lebanon's electricity sector, as well as enhancing transparency in the power sector, among others. With that, I'm going to welcome all of you again, and I'm just going to start right away with you, Neil. If you would just, yeah, you could start. You have a presentation for us, so you can share your screen.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ali. And I hope you can hear me all Okay, it's a great pleasure to be back with friends from LCPS and IFI and beyond, and fun to be talking to you about one of my pet topics, which is fossil fuel subsidies, the harm that they do, and the challenge of removing them, of fossil fuel subsidy reform. I'm going to speak for maybe about 20, 25 minutes, something like that, and then I'm really want to stop because I'm very keen to get views from Carol and from Mark and from others, and turn this into a conversation. Okay, so let me just quickly tell you why I'm keen to speak about it, and it's completely shameless advertising. I've just published a book called Ending Fossil Fuel Subsidies, The Politics of Saving the Planet, which has received some nice endorsements from various people around the world. Please go on to that link there and buy yourself a copy if you have money. And if you don't have money, I'm doing myself out of business here. It's actually open access as well, so you can download the whole thing for free. And I'll be talking about some of the main messages coming out of that book, which was published just about a month or so ago. Just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. First of all, for those of you who are not familiar with the topic, I'll just mention briefly what fossil fuel subsidies are and talk about how big they are. I'm then going to discuss a little bit about the impact of fossil fuel subsidies. And then the main focus of what I'm going to talk about today is, why do subsidies persist? Why is fossil fuel subsidy reform so hard? Exactly as you said in the intro, Ali, it's surprising that we're still talking about this subject, and yet fossil fuel subsidies are really remarkably persistent. So let's try and understand that. I'll talk very briefly about some country experience in subsidy reform and what lessons can be learned from the experience of various different countries in doing reform. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about the current approach, and more importantly, I think a more effective new approach to fossil fuel subsidy reform. Okay, so most people will know this, but what are fossil fuel subsidies? What do we mean when we talk about fossil fuels? Basically, fossil fuel subsidies come in two types. The most common ones around the world are consumption subsidies, which arise simply when you're selling energy at a price which is below the cost of supply. That means when you're selling petrol or diesel for 40 cents a liter, but it actually costs you $1 a liter, or more like $1.50 or $2 a liter these days, then that's a consumption subsidy. The same, of course, is true with electricity. In Lebanon, in particular, we're very familiar for years and years and years. The electricity tariff was unchanged, even though the cost of electricity was high, leading to huge subsidies which had to be given to EDL, and that was a big part of the debt crisis of Lebanon. So these are consumption subsidies. On the production side of things, fossil fuel subsidies are where government is explicitly or implicitly providing industry with various forms of benefits which will boost their profitability. So typically in the form of tax allowances or tax exemptions of one kind or another for fossil fuel companies. But sometimes the subsidies are disguised in the form of soft loans, guarantees, equity injections, for one kind or another for the fossil fuel industry. So two types of subsidies: consumption subsidies and production subsidies. And in homage to Mark being in Ireland, I've given an example here of the Irish government. The Irish government cut excise duties on petrol and diesel. Cutting excise duties on petrol and diesel is effectively providing a subsidy. That is to say, the difference between the price that you would normally pay and the price you're actually paying is being paid for by the government, in that case in foregone revenue. So that's what fossil fuel subsidies are. How big are they? And this is the bit that most people aren't aware of. Fossil fuel subsidies are really, really big. This is a graph produced by the OECD together with the IEA, which charts fossil fuel subsidies since 2010. And look at the scale on the left-hand side. You can see that typically fossil fuel subsidies have been around about the sort of $600 billion a year mark on a global basis. Most of that is petroleum, but a large part of it is also electricity and natural gas. So it fluctuates up and down, and it fluctuates up and down, of course, with the oil price. When oil prices are high, then domestic prices tend to be, in many countries, lower than the international price, and the gap is covered by the government, and that's the subsidy. This graph finishes in 2021, but we already know the figure for 2022. And as a consequence of Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the huge spike in oil prices and gas prices that resulted from that, the figure for 2022 is over 1,000 billion US dollars. That is to say, there are now more than 1 trillion US dollars of fossil fuel subsidies around in the world. So this problem is not only huge, I mean, by way of comparison, that's 4 times all of aid, but it's also not getting better, it's getting worse. What's the impact of fossil fuel subsidies? Well, the most obvious impact of selling fossil fuels for less than the cost of supply is that people will consume more of them. And obviously, one of the big problems we face as a planet is climate change. This is a map of the temperature change over the last 50 years. And the IMF have done an interesting study estimating what CO2 emissions, or how much CO2 emissions would be reduced if we were to charge cost-reflective prices for fossil fuels. And the answer is CO2 emissions would be around about a quarter lower if fossil fuels were priced to include both the cost of supply and also the health and environmental cost. In other words, fossil fuel subsidies are giving rise to substantial climate damage. But that's not the only impact of fossil fuel subsidies, and in some places, perhaps not even the most important one. One of the most shocking challenges that we face is outdoor air pollution. In 2017, the WHO estimate that there are about 3.4 million deaths globally due to outdoor air pollution. In some of the large countries, India and China, you're getting millions of people, or 1 or 2 million people dying every year prematurely as a consequence of very poor air quality. And the bulk of that poor air quality is coming from 2 sources. It's coming from particulate pollution from coal-fired power stations. Again, subsidizing coal means that you're going to end up with more coal-fired power stations, which means you're going to end up with more particulate pollution, or is coming from motor vehicle emissions due to the burning of petrol and diesel. So making fuel cheap doesn't help the environment, doesn't help your air quality. Fossil fuel subsidies are also extremely disequalizing. This is a couple of graphs taken from some work that I did in Nigeria recently. The one on the left-hand side shows you the budgets for education, health, and social protection for 2021 and 2022 in Nigeria. And then the gray bar is the budget for, effectively, the budget for fossil fuel subsidies. Gasoline is subsidized in Nigeria, and it's subsidized to the tune of 3 times the entire health budget. This is a country of almost 300 million people, where it is spending 3 times as much on subsidizing petrol than it is on health. Not only that, but fossil fuel subsidies are extremely unequal. The graph on the right-hand side, also taken from Nigeria, but actually could be taken from pretty much any country, shows you who's benefiting from the subsidies. And of course, the people who benefit from fossil fuel subsidies tend to be the people who use fossil fuels. That is, the people who have cars, the people who have motorbikes and so forth, and they tend to be better off. On average, the top income quintile is getting around about 6 times more benefit from subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies, than the bottom quintile across several countries. Okay, so that's the impact side of things, and we can debate the various impacts of fossil fuel subsidies. The real question, the real challenge is, if we know that these things are a bad idea, why do they persist? Why are we here still now 13 years after a commitment was made internationally to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, with bigger fossil fuel subsidies than they ever have been? Why is fossil fuel subsidy reform so hard? And I think that there are essentially 5 reasons. The first reason is, if you like, the honorable reason, which is that fossil fuel subsidy reform is difficult because it hurts people. If you are a policymaker that actually cares for the well-being of your population, fossil fuel subsidy reform almost invariably entails a significant increase in price. And significant increases in prices, as we've discovered tragically over the course of the last year or more, are extremely hard on the general population. And it's not just hard on the people who happen to have cars and people who've got motorbikes. Because fossil fuel prices rise, the price of transportation rises. Because the price of transportation rises, the price of food rises. Food, of course, is disproportionately consumed by the poor. So the little pie charts you can see there are a nice study by David Cody, in which he was pointing out that fossil fuel subsidy reform has both a direct impact, but also an indirect impact. And the indirect impact through, for example, food prices can be every bit as strong as the direct impact. Fossil fuel subsidy reform is hard because it's painful. The second reason why fossil fuel subsidy reform is difficult, though, is because it breaks the social contract. I put this nice picture of the Leviathan from Thomas Hobbes' famous book about social contract. You could pick any other social contract book you like. But the bottom line is that in many, many countries, cheap fuel, particularly countries that actually have oil, cheap fuel is part and parcel of the bargain. In Nigeria, the deal is we will give you cheap fuel, and in return, it's okay for us to rule the country. And that is the case in many oil owning and oil exporting countries. There is an implicit bargain that says we have this natural resource. We will try and give you some other things, but one thing which we will give you is a share of that resource in the form of cheaper fuel. And as a result, many countries will use that as a tool for buying support from the population, because it's very easy to provide cheap fuel. It's much more difficult to provide an effective education system, an effective infrastructure, it's effective health services and so forth. Those are complex bureaucratic things to provide, but signing something saying that this is what the price of fuel is going to be is very easy. So it's part of the social contract. A third reason why fossil fuel subsidy reform is so hard is because price increases tend to be a bit of a gift to the opposition. Oppositions often don't like their governments, believe that they're corrupt or incompetent or just generally not doing a very good job. What could be better for an opposition than a large price rise, which will get everybody out on the streets complaining about the government for all sorts of reasons, not just because of the price rise. Governments, consequently, are very reluctant to go about fossil fuel subsidy reform because they know how unpopular it can make them. And it can lead to riots. A paper that I published last year with some co-authors, we looked at data from 2005 to 2018, and we saw that many, many countries had fossil fuel riots, or fuel riots, if you like. In 2019, in Sudan, France, Zimbabwe, Haiti, Lebanon, Ecuador, Iraq, Chile, Iran. You can do the list for last year, I'm sure, if you wish. In general, fossil fuel subsidies arise because of fixed price regimes. Countries fix the price for a long period of time, then their currency depreciates or the oil price spikes internationally. You end up with huge subsidies, become unsustainable, and then you end up with a big price spike when the reform takes place, and that big price spike can lead to riots. And the picture you see is of a young Mozambican boy during the protests, the fuel riots that happened in 2010. The further reason why fossil fuel subsidy reform is hard, though, and this is getting to the slightly more the sinister political end of it, is that fossil fuel subsidy reform is opposed by those who benefit from it. Subsidy regimes invariably have beneficiaries. Think of farmers who are getting near free electricity for irrigation in India. Think of fuel importers who've got monopoly rights of one kind or another and who are earning large rents from the fuel supply chain. Think of people who can round trip cargoes. So this happened in Nigeria, for example, where you bring in a tanker load of fuel, you would offload half of it, you claim the full subsidy, you take the tanker out again, bring it back in again, offload the other half, claim the full subsidy again. This was a good way of ripping off the government. But one other constituency, and a very important constituency, one which is certainly true for Lebanon, but it's also true for many countries who have large subsidies, is smuggling. Certainly in countries where the prices are significantly below those of their neighbors, there's a very strong incentive to smuggle fuel outside of the country, and the police or the customs officials will turn a blind eye because they may well be participating in the process. The beneficiaries of these large rents being captured by those who are benefiting from the subsidy regime are often politically connected. Very often they're funding political party campaigns of one kind or another. And as a result, it makes it extremely difficult for reforms to be implemented. And then the final reason I want to put forward, and which we learned from country experience around the world, is that fossil fuel subsidy reform is hard because people don't trust the government to give them something better. As an economist, even if you give me all of the previous 4 reasons, I'll say, well, that's all very well, but fossil fuel subsidy reform is such a win. It's so large in many countries that it should be possible to do it and compensate the poor or whoever you wish to compensate for the damage and still have money left over. So why doesn't that happen? The reason why that doesn't happen is because it requires the government doing the reform to promise things to the citizenry, promise them cash transfers, promise them public transport subsidies, promise them better health, promise them better education. But if people don't believe the promises of the government, then these things are simply not credible. People will say, frankly, I prefer to have the subsidized fuel rather than having all of these things which you've promised many times before and never delivered. I was hunting for a suitable UK image of lack of trustworthiness, and this was the best one that I could come up with. I'm sure you can come up with whatever image you wish for the country that you know and love. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about country experience with fossil fuel subsidy reform. I've spoken about why it's difficult and why it's politically challenging. But many countries have tried to reform fossil fuels, including, of course, Lebanon. Let me talk a little bit about a country I know well, Indonesia. I lived in Indonesia for 8 years, still working there on and off. And President Jokowi, whose picture you can see in the top right-hand corner there, did a major campaign on subsidy reform in 2014. And there are lots of very useful lessons to be learned from that. So what he did was, he did something very unusual. During the presidential campaign, he campaigned about subsidy reform. Usually politicians don't. Usually nobody wants to talk about it unless they're absolutely forced to. And the reason why he campaigned on it was because he had an alternative. You can see in the picture, he's holding up a little card there. And he went everywhere in all of his election rallies and said, these subsidies are nuts. They don't make any sense. What I'm going to do is I'm going to abolish them, and I'm going to use the money to give you something better. I'm going to give you free healthcare. I'm going to give you free education. And he had these little health cards and education cards that he took out of his top pocket every time he was talking about them. And when he won, and he won in a landslide in 2014, he immediately abolished petrol subsidies for the main islands in Indonesia and transferred around about $16 billion out of his own budget to his own budget. In other words, $16 billion went from fossil fuel subsidies into health, education, and indeed a lot of infrastructure projects as well. He also introduced a price formula so that prices would be adjusted gradually over time with exchange rate depreciations and with international prices. So it was a case study of the perfect way of doing a subsidy reform. Then, unfortunately, in 2016, and you may recall, oil prices started to rise again. And it became a little bit politically unpopular to raise prices in line with the international price. So he stopped using the adjustment formula to raise prices and said that we would just do it on a discretionary basis. By 2018, Pertamina, which was the main state-owned oil company, was losing around about $4 billion a year as a result of this policy. And so subsidized petrol was reintroduced in the main islands of Indonesia. And in 2019, which was the next election campaign, President Jokowi didn't talk about subsidies at all. He won again. Now, what did Indonesia do right? Well, leadership really matters. And Jokowi showed that if you've got a vision of what it is you want to do, you can do a major subsidy reform. He not only communicated it, but he had an offer. He timed it very luckily. Actually, when the subsidies were reformed shortly thereafter, oil prices fell. And so he didn't have to do a major price bump. But he also timed it very well electorally. And he compensated people who were badly affected by the price rises that did exist with fairly broad targeting. So Indonesia did a lot right in how it did it. However, he learned the hard way that the political window is very short. After about a year or so, your honeymoon period is over. If you don't shift the system, it's always going to come back. He tried to shift the system by introducing a formula, but the formula broke. And then he hid the skeletons basically into the International Oil Company, but eventually that also broke. The bottom line is fossil fuel subsidy reform is a very long game. Now, I know Mark's going to talk about Lebanon, so I won't dwell on this one, but of course, Lebanon is another example of a country that has done a major fossil fuel subsidy reform. And the key thing that I learned from the Lebanese experience is that if governments fail to address the fossil fuel subsidies in a sort of structured, transparent and fair way, then it ends up happening anyway in an extremely chaotic, non-transparent and unfair way. But I'll let Mark tell the story of fossil fuel subsidy reform in Lebanon. I want to talk about some general lessons which we've learned from numerous attempts at fossil fuel subsidy reform in different countries. And I guess the number one lesson is that political will, political support is paramount. Ultimately, reducing subsidies is not a technical problem, it's a political problem. And unless you have buy-in from the top, and more importantly, a broad coalition of support, then it's extremely difficult to implement successfully. The second one is, I've called it fix it first. If you're going to actually reform fossil fuel subsidies, you need actual compliance with the rules. And compliance needs trust. And trust needs to see some real progress. So you've got to actually make sure that things which are wrong about the current system are being addressed in order to build the trust with the general population that the reform is actually going to be successful. And part of that is also about tackling corruption. I remember being quite shocked in Nigeria when I was talking to a young activist who had led a lot of the campaigns against the fossil fuel subsidy reforms in 2012, which went disastrously wrong for the government there. And I remember saying, well, what sort of compensation would you like for your fossil fuel subsidy reform? And she said, I'd like the Minister of Petroleum in jail. The Minister of Petroleum was subsequently indicted for corruption. The point that she was making was that you don't just want cash. Telling people that you're going to hurt them and then say, but it'll be okay because we're going to give you cash is not very politically attractive. People care about far bigger things. And one of the things they really care about is people not ripping them off. So tackling corruption is part and parcel of effective fossil fuel subsidy reform. Fourthly, protecting the poor matters. Sometimes the World Bank has been criticized for having an approach to fossil fuel subsidy reform that basically says, do the reform, massively hike prices, but it's okay because you're going to give the poor cash. That's a little bit unfair, but nonetheless, it's got an element of truth in it. That is that an awful lot of the focus is on protecting the poor. You do need to protect the poor, but you also need to compensate the bulk of the lower middle class, if you like. There are many, many people who are not particularly poor. That is to say, they're not in the bottom 10 or 20% of the population per se, but they really will hurt if you get a huge spike in petrol or diesel prices. And it's very important that compensatory mechanisms provide something for them as well. Fifthly, and this is the point I was making about Jokowi in Indonesia, government has to have an offer. At the end of the day, fossil fuel subsidy reform is not a very interesting or sexy thing. You've got to have something that is politically salient, which you can offer to people so that they believe that there is a possibility they're going to get something better out of that. If not, then people will never support fossil fuel subsidy reform. I remember doing a bunch of perception surveys on this topic in Indonesia and also in Nigeria, and you typically get between 70 and 80% of the population saying they're opposed to reform. So you can understand why politicians are reluctant to proceed with such reform. But where it works because politicians have come up with an attractive, politically salient offer, which actually resonates for that context. And then finally, communication. I can't tell you the number of meetings I've been in where policymakers will say, oh yes, well, we do want to do a fossil fuel subsidy reform, but we want to do it under the radar. We want to do it stealthily. This, generally speaking, fails. It's not possible to do a significant fossil fuel subsidy reform without people noticing. Effective reforms are usually accompanied by extensive communications in which politicians actually say, this is what you need to do. So let me just finish off very quickly with some key lessons, and then I'm keen to get to the discussion. First of all, fossil fuel subsidy reform is a political problem. What really matters to voters are peace, protection, prosperity. It's got to have a salient political offer. And then secondly, there are a bunch of recommendations which I'm going to put up there and which we can perhaps talk about in the discussion about what governments, donors, and researchers and civil society should do. Governments need to be far more honest and transparent about the problem, and they need to do some of the things I've just talked about. But there's also a role for donors in thinking much more politically about what this problem is, and a key role, I think, for researchers, for research institutes, and for civil society in trying to study the political economy constraints and understanding how successful transitions take place in other countries. But Ali, I can witter on about this topic forever and ever. So why don't I stop there and let Carol and Mark come in, and then we can move to the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Neil. This was, a very clear presentation, and I have to say some of the figures that you mentioned are shocking. they're shocking to hear. And this is coming from a Lebanese person, okay? So from someone who've lived through the impacts of such policies. And while you were presenting as well, I was wondering whether there's an element that maybe we're not looking at. And this is the psychological element, like following a reductionist tradition, looking at the most fundamental units of the system, which are people. I'm not sure if people are ready. They've become so conditioned to the status quo that such major changes are hard. And I think this is also, Lebanon would be a nice case study, because the crisis, the 3 years crisis, have also imposed some major behavioral constraints and changes. Some of those were pretty sudden. And so it's also interesting to see how people would adapt to such changes. I'm not gonna take much more time because I have a lot of things to say about what you presented, really interesting, but I'm just gonna go right ahead to our discussants. Who would like to, so before going to the Lebanon case, I would say maybe if you could give comments on the general topic, and then we would have Mark go into the Lebanese case study. So maybe with you, Carol.
Definitely, with pleasure. That's a very interesting topic. And thank you, Neil, for this very comprehensive presentation. I would repeat maybe some of the points that you make and highlight other related issues. And I have 2 questions for you at the end, one more about one of the graphs that you showed and another one of a conceptual nature. But first of all, when we look at fossil fuel subsidies on consumptions, of course, there are many drivers, but one of them is to protect the poor, which is often that you find in not only in the developing countries, interestingly, even in the OECD economies, and I will come back to that in a second, but also as a way of redistributing the rent from the natural resources, as we see in the GCC countries, for example. Now, whatever the intention is behind fossil fuel subsidies, how noble your principles are and the drivers are, there are unintended consequences. And first of all, if your intention was to protect the poor, well, let me tell you, we all know that the poor is not the one that is driving big cars. I mean, hardly a poor person has a car, and they are not the one with massive houses that require a lot of consumption of electricity or heating, and they are not the one who are flying around the world. So actually, the subsidies that you originally wanted to offer to help the poor benefits the poor the least, because they end up going to the rich more than who have all these kind of bigger consumption than the poor. So that's something people don't really think about. We don't really think about who is benefiting the most from these supports, from this financial support. And we can say that those who are benefiting the most are the ones that need it the least. And that raises the issue of equity and fairness. The other thing is that, I mean, of course, if there's one thing that economists all around the world and throughout history agree on, is the importance of the price signal. So the price signal drives behavior. Actually, a price signal was the one that drove energy transitions in the past, from biomass at the beginning to coal, from coal to oil. So we should not underestimate the power of the price signal. And if you distort that price signal, then you are going to distort behavior, and you are going to create distortions in the market and unintended consequences. So one of these unintended consequences and distortions is inefficiency, wasteful consumption. And that is very simple and very easy to calculate and to plot. So if you, for example, you are curious, you can go and look for gasoline prices around the world. And you can plot them on a graph. You can compare the subsidizers versus the taxers. And you can see how, for example, in Europe, taxes are very high. And if you go to Venezuela, maybe it's cheaper to buy a bottle of, to fill your car than to buy a bottle of water. But then you plot against that the energy intensity, which is a measure of your efficiency, how much energy you are using to produce, let's say, 1 unit of output. And you see a very clear correlation, undisputable, that wherever you have energy subsidies, you have very high energy intensity. I don't have the latest numbers, but there was a study by the IMF which said that half of the world's subsidies, energy subsidies, are in the Middle East and North Africa. And actually, if you look at the energy intensity in that region, this is the only region in the world where energy intensity or energy inefficiency increased and did not decrease, unlike the rest of the world. So the arguments here can be easily proven quantitatively, in addition to the qualitative and principle dimension. Then there is the other thing. Well, if you are an energy exporter, then you may have a serious trouble. We saw how Egypt, for example, run into trouble before the discovery of the Zohr field. Egypt has sizable gas resources, it has gas reserves, but they also have a very large domestic market. Gas demand is increasing rapidly. So is in Algeria. You have the same problem in Algeria. Domestic consumption is rising because of the pricing mechanism, the generous subsidies. Now, what happens here? These are countries that are in principle exporters. They export natural gas. But the difference, well, how do you get your exports? You take production minus consumption. So if consumption is low and your production is at this level, then you do have a sufficient, a sizable capacity to export. But if your consumption is rising rapidly and production is not catching up, then your capacity to export decreases over time. And that's why Egypt became a net importer for a period of time. Now, today, they could export much more than what they are exporting, but because of the domestic consumption, that is limiting the export potential. And you have limited export potential because of pricing or inefficient pricing mechanisms domestically. You are letting some revenues from exports, lucrative revenues, where you could sell your oil and gas at international prices. You are just letting go of that aspect. Now, the problem with subsidies also is that once they are in place, they are very difficult to remove. There were hunger strikes in some countries, such as Nigeria, when some presidents, for example, tried to remove those subsidies. That is the reality. When we are accustomed to some financial support, it's very difficult for us as population to let go. So something has to be given, as Neil said earlier, in return. But there is also a clash between economic rationale and political interest and realities. And this is why I want to go back to a point I mentioned earlier. Subsidies are not exclusive to developing world. Before the energy crisis last year, there were the G7, the group of seven, the seven most powerful countries, and even the G20 to a certain extent. They were constantly condemning fossil fuel subsidies and asking all the developing countries to remove their subsidies. What did they do last year when energy prices increased? What did they do here in the UK? What did they do in Germany? What did they do in Poland? What did they do in all these big economies that have been for years saying, don't give subsidies? They did exactly the opposite to what they have been advocating. And they offered generous subsidies to the population because they feared the political consequences of an aggravation of economic policy situation. And this is why we saw the IMF and the World Bank and all these respectable international organizations calling on these governments to avoid distorting price signals, to let customers be exposed to that higher prices, because that's how you induce behavioral changes. That's how you encourage people to become more conscious of their consumption. I used to live in Abu Dhabi, and their electricity is almost for free. I would leave sometimes my house and was forgetting some lights on. I wouldn't bother going back to switch them off. But I tell you, when I'm in London, before I leave my house, I make sure I switch off every single light bulb in the house. So that's what we mean with the difference in behavior. But again, there is a problem with of political interest, which clashes with economic rationale. And that's why you still have fossil fuel subsidies around the world. Now, that is on the consumption. I think Neil covered a lot the consumption aspect, but where I did not see more discussion, and I can understand why, is on the production subsidies. But that is by itself a subject that has not been well covered in the literature. So you find a lot on the consumption subsidies, but very little work has been done on production subsidies. And the reason being, especially if I talk about oil and gas, and there are several reasons there, I think I put down here a few. First of all, we need to understand, first of all, when people talk about subsidies, they often don't really understand the two things in oil and gas: the supply chain and the production profile, and the whole from the exploration to appraisal to development, production, abandonment. So they don't really understand the complex nature of the supply chain of oil and gas operations. And second, they don't understand the fiscal terms, the fiscal regime. So they pick one incentive, let's say an uplift of 5% on your capital expenditure for 6 years, and they say that's a subsidy. Well, that is not a subsidy, because the fiscal regime is much more than the just uplift. And almost everywhere around the world, the oil and gas industry pays much higher taxes than the rest of the industry. So in Norway, 78% the industry government take is from the oil and gas industry, whereas the rest of the industries pay a fraction of that, you see. So therefore, a subsidies, when we have like certain fiscal incentives that allows the industry to pay below what everybody else pays. But here, if you're starting with 90%, 80%, then giving a certain incentive, which is very targeted, very limited period of time, to encourage investment in a certain, let's say, field that is, I don't know, like maybe it has huge capital expenditures, that does not qualify as subsidies. And second, again, the fiscal terms are very important in the tax regime, is because many instruments in the oil and gas industry act like a tax, but they are not called taxes. And that's what the non-fiscal experts don't realize. And that's where everything gets muddied. So I personally would like to see, I mean, I know that the consumption subsidies is something that has been covered extensively over the years and the decades, and they are still there. The problem is still there. But where I would find quite beneficial is more work on production subsidies, because that I can tell you with great confidence that the contribution in the literature of researchers is very, very limited.
Carol,
So with that, yeah, let me just conclude and ask Neil the two questions I have, if I may. So Neil, you had a graph which showed how big subsidies are. Were you showing consumption or production subsidies or both? And second, if we agree that subsidies are bad, we know that green energy is hugely subsidized around the world. Is there a case where that subsidies is justifiable?
I just wanted to ask you if you could give us an example of the last thing that you mentioned about the kind of taxes, let's say, or that go unnoticed. Okay, if you could give us an example, if you have anything,
You will have to invite me to give you a lecture on fiscal regimes, but state participation or cost recovery ceiling, for example, these have no taxes in the definition, right? And yet they act like a tax. Yeah. So these are just examples, and they can have very upfront effect on investment and make the projects non-profitable in some cases, and they can make the regime pretty regressive.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying. So before I move to Neil, maybe it's better to have also Mark's intervention, but also Carol, something you mentioned about countries where, especially in the Middle East, the thing about rentier states, and I remember this from something I wrote a long time ago about subsidies in the Gulf countries, the usual motto, with taxation comes representation. Well, with no representation, there's no taxation. Okay, so it's, as Neil said, it goes to the very social contract in those countries, unfortunately, making it even harder than in other cases. So Mark, I'm gonna move to you, and I'm gonna give you the floor. But before, I just would like to express that it's always happy to work with you and with IFI. This event today, this webinar, is both the result of the collaboration of LCPS and IFI, who are focusing on this topic, the topic of energy and energy transition as well. So Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ali, and thanks so much, Neil and Carol, for the insights and comments. So, and congratulations again, Neil, for the book. Really interesting. So I'll try in the coming just few minutes I have just to highlight a bit on the Lebanese case study, or how things have been happening on the Lebanese case study, but just to use that example to shed light on some of the concepts that the book has included already, like Neil's book has included, and maybe we could open the discussion around that. So and in the local context, and like Neil has quickly and briefly maybe showed a bit, one of the country examples was Lebanon on that front, when it comes to countries that have been removing or subsidies in a very unorganized way recently, and especially in 2021. So I will start by asking, or trying to raise the big question: what does that mean to remove subsidies in a context like in a country like Lebanon? So the removal of subsidy came as part of an economic collapse, of a currency devaluation, deteriorating economy, and also a big loss in trust from citizens in public institutions and ministries, etc. So what does that mean really to have subsidy removal in this context, and especially on one thing that the book has highlighted on is the timing on when to remove subsidies. So in chapter 2 of the book, Neil has said that subsidy removal is something that used to be a taboo, or that used to transform ministers to ex-ministers, and it was really avoided, something that's really avoided in campaigns, in electoral campaigns and discussions, etc. So if you look at the Lebanese case study or Lebanese context, you see that subsidy removal came at a moment where, or fossil fuel subsidy removal came at a moment where citizens were really facing several other catastrophes or several other problems. And when it was removed, and I'll come in a minute to the process on how it was removed, people or the population accepted it because there was simply no other choice for them to do rather than accepting it. So they were facing first not only a devaluation of the currency, but also several other catastrophes and crises when it comes to their money in the banks, when it comes to electricity supply, when it comes to food and beverage, supermarkets, etc., medicines, hospitals, and all of those. So subsidy removal, or the hike in gasoline and diesel prices came on top of those. And of course, this is not reform by itself, and this is not the form through which reform should be done in any country. And the book has highlighted on a series of examples of several other countries that have done so. Why it is not really the right way to do it? Because really it has happened in a very unplanned way. So it was done in an unorganized manner. It was not really communicated. And here I will come again to the concept of communication that the book also highlights on at the end. But not only not well communicated, no alternatives were also provided. So there was no real careful signaling or information on the expectations, or how would this step would enforce or would highlight and affect the population or the citizens response to that. So when we talk about subsidy removal, and along in addition to the countries that Neil has highlighted on, I've been also looking recently over in the MENA region, and some of the cases highlighted in the book, for example, Iran, Egypt, to some extent, all of them, and Jordan in early, like 10 years ago or a decade ago in 2012 as well. Most of those countries have removed subsidies, but have on the other hand, have provided something related to social safety nets, or have provided some other services when it comes to healthcare, education, public transportation, even direct payment or cash payments that Neil has highlighted on also. And also in Iran sometime, and in Jordan, there were some offers, some housing alternatives, etc. So if you look at the Lebanese case, there was nothing at all of those. There were some talks about some cash payments that should be done, or cash cards, social cards that would support citizens in this process of subsidy removal, but we never saw those happening. There were some grants or loans, let's say, from international organizations also that benefited some chunks of the society and not all citizens. So the way that happened, it was really unorganized, not communicated, etc. But putting this aside, and what's really fascinating, I cannot say it's fascinating, but what's really interesting in the Lebanese case is this dynamic or interlinkage or relationship that was really moving between the policymakers or the ones that have decided to remove the subsidies and the private sector. And here I'm saying, or I'm talking about the companies that are importing or used to import fossil fuels, namely gasoline, diesel, etc. So this interlinkage or this dynamic was really interesting at that front, and really it has helped the purpose or helped the government in its purpose by removing subsidies. And I'll say how. So we all know that in Lebanon there is a cartel of companies, 13 companies that used to import gasoline and diesel. So there's no real competition. They don't compete with each other, but their utmost, let's say, goal is to keep their profits, let's say, stable. So when subsidy removal started gradually from 1,500 exchange rate to 3,900 exchange rate, and then to Alisar, if you could just mute your microphone. So when the exchange rate was removed from 3,900 then to 8,000, then what happened is that those private sector knew about that, because there were really a really interesting relationship or interlinkage with the policy making. They knew that the prices are going to increase, and what they did is they said, why do we need to sell at this current price while we know that the price is going to increase and we're going to make more profits? So what they've done simply is that they hoarded quantities, they withheld quantities for a long period of times, and as a result, we all remember, and the picture in Neil's slides showed the long queues in front of petrol stations that happened during the summer of 2021 and even the spring of 2021. So there was anger, there was tension, there was frustration among citizens, and rather than asking the government to keep the subsidy and not to remove the subsidy on fossil fuels, the social, let's say, focus has been shifted into not only keeping the subsidy, but also then removing the queues. So we don't want to. They said we are ready to pay the price of gasoline and diesel, even if it was higher, but don't let us stand in queues. And out of a like surprise, this has created a separate problem, or this has created an additional problem that the government has benefited from, or it had served the purpose of the government. So subsidy removal for the government was the cure to that problem. All right, so if you want to remove the queues or don't want to see queues, we have to increase prices, and this is how it happened. So, and as a result of this just brief on the Lebanese case study, the most important message, and I think this is where one of the book's chapter highlight on, is when we always talk about subsidy, fossil fuel subsidies, we always try to demonize those fossil fuel subsidies and try to show them as something bad. Like, I think that subsidy by itself, and this is what the books highlight in different sections, it's not really bad by itself, but it is, the big question is how and when it is implemented, the subsidy, and when it is removed, if it has to be removed, but also most importantly is who is benefiting from it and who are really the right beneficiaries of this subsidy. When we talking about commodities or services like electricity provision or gasoline or diesel, those we don't need to forget that those are somehow in some cases like services, and the subsidy removal process is transforming them into commodities and into a luxury for some citizens to be able to afford or to pay their price. So one takeaway of this is that do we really think that the Indonesian case study or providing other services like healthcare, education is one right thing to do, or giving cash payments is another thing that would really serve the purpose of subsidy removal or not? The question of timing is really important, when and how to remove subsidies, and most importantly, the communication. So, and the book says communicate, communicate, communicate. So if it has to be removed, how to remove it and how to inform citizens that this is gonna happen and what alternative they are benefiting from. The last point I'm going to end with is, and one takeaway of the book itself, but also of the case study and several case studies, is when we talk about energy, and here maybe it overlaps with what Carol has mentioned earlier, is that when you talk about subsidy, fossil fuel subsidies, or even the removal of those subsidies, we need to think and work politically. So it's not about the technical issue of removing subsidies, it's about the political context, and we need to really understand the political context of each country where subsidies are offered or provided, or they will be removed, so that we know how to remove them and in what context to remove them. So this is the importance of thinking and working politically and linking this process to the political economy of each country. This is what Lebanon has taught us from the experience of the past 2 years, and I think a lot of overlapping lessons learned with the case studies that the book really highlights on. I'll stop here and happy to answer anything later on, but congrats again, Neil, on the book.
Thanks a lot, Mark, and thank you for the overview on the Lebanon case study. So before I move to you, Neil, with your responses to the many questions that you received from both Carol and Mark, I think we have to, I have to ask you first if you're willing to extend maybe for 5 or 10 minutes, if that's possible, with you, Neil, and Carol and Mark. 5 minutes, sure. Okay, so let us start with Carol's questions, maybe with the second question. She was asking about, okay, if subsidies are bad, why are we doing this for renewables? And this goes to also what Mark said about that. Maybe you could clarify this point. Are subsidies inherently bad, or is it a case-by-case thing? So maybe, Neil, the floor is yours.
Subsidies bad, or is it a case-by-case thing? I mean, I think Carol's absolutely right to point out the hypocrisy of the European countries in particular, preaching for more than a decade that subsidies were bad. And then as soon as they experience a really serious oil price shock or a gas price shock, then suddenly what do we see? We see subsidies. And not only that, and I think it's been very interesting politically, how European countries have got themselves in exactly the same position as many, many other countries have been in across the world for many years, where they had to implement a subsidy to protect people, but they didn't protect the poor. So their objective was not to say, well, okay, this is going to be really hard on the poor, so what we'll do is we'll have a targeted cash transfer towards the poor in order to make sure that they can meet their energy bills. What they did was they fixed the rate. Well, when you fix the rate, you're giving most of the subsidy to the people who consume a lot. And that's precisely what's happened. So again, the European Union has, and UK for that matter, have replicated precisely the same unequal distribution of subsidy as you see in all other countries around the world. Now, the question then is why? Why have they done that? And the answer is because it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor, you all vote. And so politically, it's been much more acceptable to say that everybody will pay a fixed rate than it was to say, well, actually, you rich folk, you're perfectly capable of absorbing this major shock. And we want you to absorb this shock in order for us to have a bit more money left over to help the poor. That would have been a much more, that would have been the economist's solution. That would have been a much more pro-poor solution, but it wasn't nearly as politically acceptable a solution. And so European countries have rushed to fixing rates in exactly the same way as other countries have done for a long time. So what lesson do I draw from that? Ultimately, reforming fossil fuel subsidies is never going to be a political top priority for anybody. What matters is protecting your citizenry and protecting your own power. So as a consequence, we need to think politically, as Mark was saying, we need to think about what's the perspective of the politicians on this. They need to protect citizenry. It's a good thing to do. You know, this is a horrible shock. The governments of Europe had the resources available to be able to do that. And so they protected them by fixing prices. However, if you fix prices for a long period of time, you will end up in trouble. So the question is, how do you protect people over the short run? But let's not try and not pretend that we're protecting the poor. We're protecting everybody in the short run. But how do you also engineer a system which is fiscally sustainable, which is responsible, which is efficient, as Carol was pointing out, because subsidies lead to huge inefficiencies, very high energy intensities around the world, and which is also fair, which gradually allows you to claw back those resources and devote them to things which voters themselves would prefer those resources to be used for. That's the challenge. The challenge isn't to just get rid of subsidies because subsidies are bad. Sometimes subsidies are necessary in order to be able to achieve social outcomes that you wish to achieve. This is where you made a point, Carol, about are green subsidies good? Well, I predict that in 10, 15 years' time, we're going to be saying, oh, how do we unwind all of these green subsidies? But for now, green subsidies probably are good. In general, as economists, we say we should tax bad things and we should subsidize good ones. We need to make a rapid transition towards low carbon energy, and therefore having subsidies towards low carbon energy makes sense now, but it won't make sense forever. At a point when the market picks up and is able to deliver in a commercially effective way green energy, then those subsidies will no longer be something. But I guarantee by that stage there will be a whole set of vested interests who are determined to keep on with them. So we're going to be discussing in a decade or so, you know, what do we do about trying to claw back some of the green subsidies in order to be able to devote it to something else which we regard as more valuable. So this is an evolving space.
So there seems to be something that is peculiar to energy subsidies. So we could talk about, you know, there's this margin, this scope of impact that is similar and common between all sources of energy, whether fossil or renewable.
I think that's right. I think actually it's an issue of visibility and salience. I think price subsidies and energy subsidies are usually in the form of price subsidies. I take your point about Carol about more on production subsidies, but most, maybe 3/4 of all energy subsidies are consumption subsidies, and most of those are price subsidies, and they're just really visible. Everybody can go along to the petrol station and look and say, look, that's the price of gasoline, that's the price of diesel. So as a result, they're much more politically salient, and therefore politicians want to have control over them. The same is not true of, you know, the innards of the fiscal regime of the oil industry, which are poorly understood, and most people don't have very much visibility on it. I mean, Carol, I would slightly challenge what you were saying about the fiscal regime. I'm conscious that you're on the board of NRGI, so you know much more about this than I do. But the work which was done, I'm sure you're familiar with it, by SEI on production side subsidies in the US, I thought was very interesting, because I think it showed quite comprehensively that significant subsidies towards the oil and gas industries achieve one of two things. They either pad the profits of oil and gas companies, which is not probably something we want to be doing at the moment, or if they're not padding the profits of those companies, then they're enabling marginal projects to go ahead, which probably shouldn't go ahead if those subsidies didn't exist. So either way, those subsidies are not playing a social good.
Actually, Neil, if I may comment, because you mentioned that report, I was asked to review that study, and they had a selection of countries. And so far, the only evidence that we found of that is in some very specific cases of the US. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Thank you. So maybe I'm just going to take one or two questions. Let's see if we're going to be able to cover a couple of questions. So shouldn't fossil fuel subsidies in the first place be redirected to be to investment in clean energy production? And we have also Charlie Lowry, and maybe Charlie, if you could write your question while Neil answers this one. And maybe this would be a faster way of doing it, if that's possible, please. So Neil, I'm just gonna leave you to answer that question, the one that I just.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, Ernst, and thank you very much. I just put a sort of initial response in the chat. And by the way, everybody, please pile into the chat with your comments and views and questions. This is a standard response, which is being said repeatedly, particularly by a northern-based research institution. Oh, what we need is an energy transition. We've got all these bad fossil fuel subsidies. What we should do is we should take fossil fuel subsidies and we should switch them over towards clean energy. In principle, that's a good thing to do. The point that I've been making in the book is that the only politically feasible way of actually tackling fossil fuel subsidies in any given country is if they are used for something that is politically salient. Sometimes clean energy will be politically salient. Sometimes it's a bit of an irrelevance. I've just come back from looking at this issue in Zambia. And in Zambia, what people want is they want a health clinic and they want their kids to go to secondary school. And maybe they want to have a non-dirt road into their village and so forth. And they'll keep on working their way down the list. And clean energy will be pretty far down that list. So if the Zambian government were to turn around and say, well, we're going to get rid of our fossil fuel subsidies, but we're going to transfer it all to clean energy, the Zambian population would say, what the heck are you doing? We told you already what we want is a clinic, what we want is a school. So it's really important that resources are channeled in a way that has political resonance, that gives people the political capital to actually push through the reform. So I don't think we should be dictating what those resources are used for.
Yeah, it's about risk sensitivity, at some point. So I'm just gonna take, Charlie's question. So, and also maybe another, if you have time, Neil. If not, I'll just wrap up, okay? So in addition to the 5 reasons identified by Neil, at least 4 other problems seem to pose themselves in the Lebanese case. And I wonder what you make of them. First, the lack of alternative energy sources and infrastructures, and the absence of a credible national renewable energy plan. Then, second, you have the fact that fossil fuels are linked to Syrian security interests and syndicates. And then the fourth, critically and most troubling, the risk of clean energy subsidies being funneled into new or existing cartel structures. So, examples.
Yeah, so very quickly on those, hi Charlie, and great questions. I mean, I think your point on the lack of alternative energy sources is a really good one. Actually, it's the one that Mark was making, which is that when you say, okay, we're going to do something nasty to you and we're not going to give you any alternative, everybody is really angry. In fact, I loved your description, Mark, of the way in which the subsidy reform was done in Lebanon. And it was either done in a very incompetent way, or frankly, I think it was done in a very cynical way. There were weeks and weeks and weeks of queues at petrol stations. Everybody got really hot and really, really angry, so that the solution to the problem was a massive hike in the price and getting rid of the subsidies. This is not a fair and a transparent and a reasonable way of dealing with fossil fuel subsidies. This is a case study of how not to do it, or to do it in a very unfair way. But what the government, I'm sure, we're thinking of is, well, how can we make the situation really, really bad so that we then look like we're the solution to the problem? Now that's pretty cynical. I may be wrong about that. Somebody may correct me. But anyway, I think the lack of alternatives is really right. So government should be investing in those alternatives. Key amongst those alternatives are transport options in urban areas, which is why good subsidy reforms always have good investment in transport options, making sure that people can actually use public transport so they're not completely stuffed. This is what made Macron's relatively benign reforms in 2018 fail, because an awful lot of people in France live in rural areas, and they run diesel cars, and they were like, what are we supposed to do? So there's no bus. Secondly, you're alluding to this connection between fossil fuels and the Syrian security interests. I think this is a really important point. This was actually my point 4 in my list, which is that there are always interests in every fossil fuel subsidy regime who are benefiting from this. Ultimately, you won't get a reform unless you actually have a high-level political settlement between those interests, or you have a coalition which is able to effectively defeat those interests. But if you ignore them, or you don't even analyze them or recognize that they exist, the most typical high-level analyses of fossil fuel subsidy reforms in Lebanon would say, oh, well, they're less than cost. Well, I mean, they're gone now, but and therefore you should get rid of them. And what you should do is you compensate the poor. And it wouldn't even mention the fact that there are links to the Syrian security apparatus. But actually, that really matters. You have to understand that, and you're going to figure out a plan for what you're going to do about it in order to make a reform stick. And then this is an interesting one, which is your last one about clean energy subsidies being funneled into new cartels. I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised if that's true. And Mark, you might want to comment on that, because I know you know what's been going on in clean energy investment in Lebanon. But this is also an opportunity. And let me tell you a story from Indonesia, which slightly shocked me, but also is a very interesting way in which cartels move on. Indonesia is a very coal-dependent country, incredibly coal-dependent country. And the coal cartels and the coal magnates effectively run the show, and they fund a lot of politics in Indonesia. Indonesian coal magnates have now realized that Indonesia has huge amounts of rare earth minerals, in particular nickel. And so now all of these coal magnates are investing billions of dollars into new battery parks processing nickel so that they can capture, and their intent is quite clearly to capture the battery market for Southeast Asia. So giving cartels, giving coal magnates, giving oligarchs an opportunity to make more money from something which is not fossil fuel based is actually a way for them to exit without completely collapsing. It's a way of minimizing the opposition that you actually get from these cartels. Most oligarchs you go and talk to say that they'd love to be green. It's true in Saudi Arabia as it is in Indonesia. So it's worth thinking about it from the oligarch or from the cartel's perspective. What would make them behave in a way which is more socially acceptable? Between the devil and the deep blue sea. Thank you, Charlie. I totally agree.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Neil, for this. Should I take one more question, or are we too late? I'll leave it to you. And
I'm okay to take another question, but I'm sure people will be getting bored of the sound of my voice by now.
No, I'm
Maybe
sure.
one more.
Yeah, one more, exactly. Mark, is it fine with you? Okay, great. So I'm going to take one from Jamal Daw. And Jamal is asking, in your book, you said many countries subsidize liquefied petroleum gas to encourage switching away from dirtier fuels. You also said that in 2021, the price increase of LPG in India caused millions of households to switch back to using firewood, reversing some of the gains from introducing LPG in the first place. You say similar shifts have been documented in Brazil, Kenya, Rwanda, and Vietnam. I haven't done my research here, but did these countries do something to tackle the shift? What could they have done? For example, it seems to me that relapse is the largest problem in subsidy reforms.
Yeah, so the issue of LPG subsidies is a really challenging one. If one envisages situations where you're trying to move people away from using biomass for cooking, then one which causes all sorts of health problems and as well as deforestation, then one major solution which is being piloted and pushed and funded all around the world is to shift to LPG. LPG is a much more clean cooking solution, and emissions are much lower than other things, and it's certainly much less polluting. So there's huge programs trying to get everybody hooked on LPG. But if you get everybody hooked on LPG and you're buying the LPG at the world market price and you're selling it at a fixed local price in order to make it affordable for poor people, then the gap has got to get covered from somewhere, and the gap gets covered by the government. If you structure that subsidy in such a way that it grows and grows and grows and grows and grows, in other words, that the price of LPG remains fixed for a long period of time, then eventually you end up with a huge subsidy. Indonesia is in precisely this situation at the moment. In 2007, it did a massive kerosene replacement program, which was a good thing. It got everybody switched over to LPG, and it said, we're going to sell this LPG to you cheap, and it set a price. It's been politically impossible since 2007 to change that price. A bit like the electricity price in Lebanon from 1994. It was impossible to change it for decades. It's been impossible in Indonesia to change that price. LPG subsidy is now the biggest single energy subsidy in Indonesia. They spend billions of dollars every year on subsidizing this thing, and it's becoming a macroeconomic risk. So there's a real challenge there, because then when it breaks, LPG prices become very high again. All of those people who you hooked onto LPG will say, and they'll run back to the forest or whatever and start chopping wood, and you're back to square one. The solution, of course, is to have a mechanism of dealing with the subsidy as you go along, and gradually over time phasing out the use of fossil cooking and bringing in the use of electricity for cooking, which can be then provided by renewables. But that takes a long time. It takes quite a bit of investment. It takes a bit of forethought. It takes you having a subsidy mechanism which doesn't get you into recurring crisis. Mark, do you want to come in on the Lebanese side of things as well?
Before you, Mark, you mentioned, Neil, Lebanon, but also Lebanon, not just in the case of energy, because even pegging the lira, these are two commodities. We also pegged the lira for such a long period of time without making it sensitive to the fluctuations in the market and the economy. And yeah, this is what we ended up with.
Exactly. It doesn't have to be a direct price support. If you peg the lira, it's the same thing. Yeah.
So it might be worse, maybe at some point.
Yeah, maybe worse.
Much more fundamental commodity than energy,
Yeah, because people used on that point exactly, and I'll be very, very short and quick. On that point, people never claimed, or let's say talked about the peg of the lira or the exchange rate by itself, but they've said they've always raised the voice on the subsidy of gasoline or diesel or even food and beverage, etc. But if you compare the numbers, I mean, you could ask what had made harm more to the economy and what had reached to the 2019 collapse or not. But in briefly on Charlie's last point, I think we are at the edge currently in Lebanon when it comes to renewable energy companies or this sector that's growing. One challenge is that people are going if you don't really organize it, or if you don't really put the structure of it when it comes to the companies that are eligible to install solar panels, we are going to a way that's really chaotic, and that would be similar to the unorganized manner that has happened on fossil fuel subsidy removal that I spoke about. So you have really, again, here no other choice. Either you work with some of those companies that are really trustworthy to be able to work with, and they know what they are doing, or you go to someone that's really doesn't have the experience in that, and you would end up having a system that's really falling in few months time or in a year time, and then you would say, oh, the renewable energy is bad, or solar panels are really bad, and they didn't end up giving me an alternative solution. So I think currently while we are talking, the risk of having this, let's say, cartel, quote unquote, of clean energy companies is still very nascent, is still, I see it far from happening, but there's a risk always on how we deal. If we continue dealing with this crisis and with renewable energy systems being now spread across the country with the same way, we will end up having something similar to what happened on the fossil fuel. But currently there's a big room because of the depth of the crisis, because there's no electricity, there's big room for those companies and for individuals to play. But yes, I mean, this is a point that very well raised by Charlie, that we might end up transforming those subsidies from one place, giving them to the other. That's really a cartel, or a cartel in the making when it comes to renewable energy. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark, for these comments. And I'm going to have to really stop there.
Thanks a lot.
And wrap it up now, because we're 20 minutes beyond our scheduled time. So I'm going to thank all of you. And Neil, as much as I want to ask you about the connection between, our risk sensitivity with, in making economic choices, how much, this affects our economic choices, including what we're talking about, I'm going to leave it for another occasion. I would like to thank all our audience and the people who participated in this. I would like to thank also the IFI team, communication team as well, who helped us in organizing this. The LCPS team as well, of course, and our interpreter, Rana, thank you. And Neil, of course, thanks a lot for being keen on giving us this presentation and this talk, and Mark as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, the SBS. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated.